Resident Evil is big, like one of the most successful franchises in all of gaming big. With over 142 million copies sold worldwide, this is Capcom's best-selling franchise, and there are no signs of Capcom slowing down. With Resident Evil 4 Remake having sold over 3 million copies within the first 2 days of release, Capcom is well aware of their track record with the previous remakes and numbered entries selling millions of copies each. For those wondering if Capcom were going to put a pause on any upcoming remakes of the Resident Evil franchise, well, their latest survey suggests that Capcom are already interested in which remake gets done next. Thanks to a recent article published on June 1st by tech4gamers.com, Capcom has already sent out surveys asking fans about which Resident Evil games they'd want remade next. This is the question as featured on the survey here on the top of your screen, asking fans with writing which game or games they'd like to see featured in an upcoming remake. Now, although no remake has been confirmed at this point, Capcom sending a survey out like this definitely suggests that they are interested in seeing what games in the Resident Evil franchise fans would like to see remade next. In fact, a survey just like this one was sent out shortly after the release of Resident Evil 3 Remake, asking the same question. Fast forward 2 years after Resident Evil 3 Remake, in the year 2022, we got word from Capcom that a remake of Resident Evil 4 was officially in development. So just knowing that these surveys are being sent out after the release of Resident Evil 4 is certainly reassuring that Capcom are still very much interested in gauging public interest in what kinds of remakes are most desirable. Now, I want to know from all you fans of Resident Evil which games you'd like to see remade in the future. Make sure to let me know in the comments, but as for me, I have 3 games in particular that I am really interested in seeing Capcom remake. Let me know if you agree with my list or not after watching the video. Starting with my third pick before landing on the game I am most hopeful to see remade, coming in at third place would be a remake of Resident Evil 5. Resident Evil 5 was an incredibly popular game when it came out, featuring a fun co-op campaign and an incredible mercenaries mode to boot. But there was a vocal base of fans that felt like Resident Evil 5, for as fun as it was, underdelivered. As someone who came into Resident Evil 5 expecting big improvements over the already incredible Resident Evil 4, I was ultimately a little disappointed with the game's campaign, in that it felt a bit underwhelming with its lack of eerie environments and good tension and atmosphere that Resident Evil 4 had. Add to it the very similar control scheme to Resident Evil 4 and the game's leaning into even more action-heavy territory over the already action-heavy Resident Evil 4 made Resident Evil 5 feel like it just could have been a bit more. With a remake of Resident Evil 5, Capcom could incorporate all the incredible gameplay elements brought to the table in Resident Evil 4 Remake, like the ability to aim while shooting, parrying enemy attacks, etc. For those playing solo through the campaign, enhanced partner AI would certainly be much appreciated. In addition to the aforementioned features, creating more tension and atmosphere throughout the game would certainly help as well, with perhaps more areas in which Chris Redfield and Sheva got separated to instill some elements of isolation and truly being alone to fend off against the elements. There are a lot of ways to help make Resident Evil 5's campaign be better than it was when it released in 2009, but those are just some of the improvements that could be made that have come to my attention. If Resident Evil 5 were to get remade, which I am sure many of you think it is likely to get a remake, what sorts of things would you like to see in an RE5 remake? With the ending of Resident Evil 4 Remake possibly suggesting an inevitable remake of RE5, only time will tell to see if a remake of Resident Evil 5 will be next in line for us. Regardless, let me know your thoughts in the comments as to what you'd like to see in a remake of Resident Evil 5. The next game I'd like to see in my number 2 spot was a toss-up for me, but I ultimately decided on Resident Evil Code Veronica. I can easily see how many fans would want this to be the next Resident Evil game that Capcom remakes, so count this as my second number 1, as I am equally enthusiastic to see this game get a remake as my first pick. Code Veronica was initially supposed to be Resident Evil 3 before Capcom decided that that name would instead go to Jill Valentine's chapter of her escape out of Raccoon City and from Nemesis in what would eventually be called Resident Evil 3 Nemesis. Resident Evil Code Veronica is a classic Resident Evil game, originally released on the Sega Dreamcast in February of 2000, being the first Resident Evil to create real-time 3D environments, allowing the camera to pan and follow Claire and Chris Redfield throughout a T-virus-infested Rockford Island. This game featured the series' same tank-like controls of the game's past, some solid puzzles, and very much felt like an old-school Resident Evil game, making Code Veronica appeal greatly to fans for a potential remake. The game was released a year later on the PS2, and then the GameCube under the name Resident Evil Code Veronica X, which contained 10 minutes of extra cutscenes and some graphical touch-ups while preserving the core gameplay of the original Dreamcast release. The game is known as one of the best Dreamcast games of all time, and one of the best old-school Resident Evil games with an impressive Metacritic average of 94. Although this game is currently available on the PlayStation Store and Xbox Store as part of an HD remaster, Code Veronica definitely deserves a remake in the same vein as Resident Evil 2 Remake, and would make sense as the next remake for the franchise, as this game gives series antagonist Albert Wesker a good deal of screen time. These recent remakes have introduced to the series a lot of new fans that have never played the older games in the franchise, and by jumping into Resident Evil 5 without giving these new players proper exposure to Albert Wesker would leave many players understandably confused. A Code Veronica remake would absolutely address that, other than Code Veronica being an absolutely stellar old-school Resident Evil game that would greatly benefit from the remake treatment. This leads me to my personal number one, being a remake of the Resident Evil 1 remake. Yep, this game was remade back in 2002 on the GameCube and has since received HD editions that have made it to various platforms. But this remake was so well received as it breathed new life into the original game. The game's director and creator of Resident Evil, Shinji Mikami, wanted this remake to be the vision he had of the original PS1 game, that game simply could not have been due to the technical limitations of the hardware. This GameCube remake was faithful to the PS1 release, but introduced beautifully rendered 3D backgrounds, better controls, new gameplay mechanics, new enemies, reworked puzzles, more explorable areas, a tighter script, and an entire subplot that was cut from the original game. What I loved about Resident Evil 2 Remake were the fully 3D environments and the third-person gameplay that took us through the iconic locations of that game. And I know a remake like that of the Resident Evil 1 Remake would do incredibly well. Again, this game just kicks major ass as it is right now, but having a modern third-person perspective roaming the halls of the Twisted Spencer Mansion and its surrounding areas would be a real treat, and like Code Veronica, would introduce players to the original cast of characters of Resident Evil that included the very own Albert Wesker, of whom plays a very important role in the game's narrative, and would be essential for players to see before a remake of Resident Evil 5. So yeah, those are my thoughts on the ordering of the Resident Evil games that I would love to see remade next by Capcom. And now I want to know from you all in the comments what you'd like to see in a future Resident Evil remake. I have a feeling that many of you are going to request a remake of Resident Evil 3, and to that, I say, right on. While it is exciting to see Capcom sending out these surveys, I expect the next remake to land in about 3 years, with Resident Evil 9 coming out sooner, but that's just a hunch. If you are craving some more Resident Evil lore, well, I got a video for you about the mysterious and badass Hunk, diving deeper into his backstory about why he is so powerful. Perhaps a new game in the future about Hunk? Anyway, thanks as always for stopping by, and I look forward to seeing you all real soon in the next one. Peace.